In the Ouras Mountains of northeastern Algeria, at an elevation of just over 1,000 meters on a plateau that looks south toward the Sahara, there is a Roman city so well preserved that the first archaeologists who uncovered it in the 1880s found themselves walking streets that had not been walked in 12 centuries. The streets were still there, their paving stones in place. The columns of the Forum colonnade were standing. The Arch of Trajan, erected in the 2nd century to honor the emperor under whose authority the city was built, was intact. The library, whose curved reading room was designed to hold several hundred volumes in recessed niches around its walls, was still standing to its full height. The public latrines, a row of stone seats over a channel through which water once ran continuously, were still in their positions. The baths were intact. The theater, carved into a natural slope and capable of holding 3,000 spectators, needed only its wooden fittings to be usable again. This was Timgad. Its Roman name was Thamagati, or in the official dedication of the city, Colonia Marciana Ulpia Triana Thamagati, a name that recorded in stone the specific occasion of its founding. The colony named for Marciana, the sister of the Emperor Trajan, founded under the authority of Trajan himself, established in the year 100 CE by the 3rd Augustan Legion as a settlement for its veterans. The city was built in a single construction campaign, laid out from scratch on a plateau that had no previous urban settlement, planned as a perfect grid of streets at right angles to each other, organized around a central forum that served as the civic and commercial heart of a city designed to embody Roman order in the mountains of North Africa. For nearly 3 centuries, Timgad functioned as the city its founders intended, a prosperous colonial settlement, its population growing beyond the original grid into sprawling suburbs in every direction, its civic life conducted in the public buildings that gave Roman urbanism its specific character. Then the empire weakened, the military garrison that protected the city was reduced, and the raids of the desert peoples to the south became more frequent and more devastating. In the 5th century, the Vandals swept through North Africa. In the 6th, the city was briefly occupied by a Berber tribe. In the 7th, the Arab conquest of North Africa transformed the religious and cultural landscape of the entire region. And at some point in this succession of catastrophes and transformations, Timgad was abandoned, its population dispersed, its buildings gradually covered by the wind-blown sand and soil of the plateau on which it had been built. The sand preserved what human occupation had not destroyed. The very completeness of the abandonment, the fact that nobody built over Timgad's ruins in the way that later populations built over the ruins of Rome or Carthage, meant that the structures the archaeologists uncovered in 1881 were in the condition left by their last inhabitants rather than modified by subsequent centuries of reuse and renovation. Timgad emerged from the sand as a fossil, a nearly complete specimen of a Roman provincial city frozen at the moment of its abandonment. The analogy of the fossil is apt in another sense. Like a fossil, Timgad preserves the form of something that was once alive in a medium that is alien to its original life. The city that the archaeologists uncovered was not a living city but the empty shell of one, its streets intact but emptied of the feet that had worn them smooth, its forum colonnades standing but stripped of the statues and the crowds that had given them their meaning, its baths preserved but cold and dry rather than warm and full of water and conversation. The recovery of the physical form of the city from the sand was an extraordinary achievement of archaeology. The recovery of the life that once animated that form is a different and more difficult project, one that requires not only the excavation of the physical remains but the patient reading of the inscriptions, the mosaics, the objects, and the literary sources that together allow the imagination to reconstruct something of what it meant to live in this specific place at this specific time. The specific character of the sand that buried Timgad made the preservation possible. The dry, silty soil of the Ouras Plateau, carried by the winds that blow off the Sahara, accumulated gradually around and eventually over the city's structures, protecting the stone surfaces from the weathering that exposure to rain and frost produces, sealing the floors and their contents in place, and preventing the vegetation growth that breaks apart masonry over time. The conditions of burial were not uniform across the city, and the degree of preservation varies from structure to structure depending on how completely each was buried and on the specific character of the fill material. But in the best preserved sections, particularly the Forum and the main streets, the accumulated soil had protected surfaces and features that would otherwise have been lost long before the 19th century. The very completeness of the abandonment, the fact that nobody built over Timgad's ruins in the way that later populations built over the ruins of Rome or Carthage, meant that the structures the archaeologists uncovered in 1881 were in the condition left by their last inhabitants rather than modified by subsequent centuries of reuse and renovation. Timgad emerged from the sand as a fossil, a nearly complete specimen of a Roman provincial city frozen at the moment of its abandonment. The founding of Timgad by the 3rd Augustan Legion in 100 CE was not an accident of geography but a deliberate act of imperial policy, and understanding it requires understanding the specific strategic and political situation of Roman North Africa at the turn of the 2nd century. The 3rd Augustan Legion was the permanent garrison of Roman North Africa throughout the imperial period, stationed in the region for most of 3 centuries and responsible for the defense of the southern frontier of the Roman province of Numidia against the raids of the semi-nomadic peoples of the Saharan zone. The legion's permanent base was at Lambesis, approximately 20 kilometers from the future site of Timgad, and the strategic importance of the Ouras mountain region, which formed the natural barrier between the settled agricultural zone of the North African coast and the desert beyond, made it a priority for Roman military attention. The decision to found Timgad as a veteran settlement was a standard element of Roman colonial policy. The practice of settling retired soldiers in new cities in frontier regions served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided for the economic security of veterans who had completed their 25 years of service, giving them land and property in place of the cash payment that was the alternative form of veteran benefit. It established a population of Roman citizens in strategically important areas, creating a civilian presence that complemented the military garrison without requiring the continued expense of military occupation. And it created new cities in the Roman mold, extending the infrastructure of Roman urban civilization into regions that had not previously experienced it. The specific allocation of land at Timgad followed established Roman colonial practice. Each veteran received a plot of agricultural land outside the city walls and a building lot within the city on which to construct a house. The dimensions of the lots were standardized, reflecting the grid plan of the city and ensuring that every veteran settler began with an equal share of the urban space. The agricultural land allocated to the colony was surveyed and divided using the Roman technique of centuriation, a grid survey that divided the landscape into regular units whose traces in the form of field boundaries and access roads are sometimes still visible in modern aerial photography of North African agricultural landscape centuries after the practice itself was discontinued. The 3rd Augustan Legion that built Timgad was, by 100 CE, one of the most experienced military engineering organizations in the empire. Legions were not simply fighting forces but comprehensive engineering and construction organizations, capable of building roads, bridges, aqueducts, fortifications, and entire cities as well as conducting military campaigns. The speed with which Timgad was constructed, with the basic urban infrastructure complete within a single construction season, reflects the organizational capacity of a legion that had built numerous military installations throughout the province. The veteran settlers who received their plots of land at Timgad were men who had spent most of their adult lives in the highly organized world of the Roman military, with its fixed hierarchies, its standardized routines, and its systematic approach to every task from construction to combat. The transition from military to civilian life in a new city was in many respects a continuation of the organized existence they had known rather than a radical departure from it, and the specific character of Timgad's urban culture, with its emphasis on public order, civic ceremony, and the visible demonstration of Roman values in the built environment, may reflect something specific about the character of a city whose founding generation was composed of men trained by the Roman legion. Legions were not simply fighting forces but comprehensive engineering and construction organizations, capable of building roads, bridges, aqueducts, fortifications, and entire cities, as well as conducting military campaigns. The speed with which Timgad was constructed, with the basic urban infrastructure complete within a single construction season, reflects the organizational capacity of a legion that had built numerous military installations throughout the province and that could draw on the specialized skills of its engineers, surveyors, architects, and craftspeople. The practice of settling retired soldiers in new cities in frontier regions served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided for the economic security of veterans who had completed their 25 years of service, giving them land and property in place of the cash payment that was the alternative form of veteran benefit. It established a population of Roman citizens in strategically important areas, creating a civilian presence that complemented the military garrison without requiring the continued expense of military occupation. And it created new cities in the Roman mold, extending the infrastructure of Roman urban civilization into regions that had not previously experienced it. The specific site of Timgad, on the plateau between the Auras Mountains and the edge of the desert, was chosen for reasons that combined the military and the practical. The plateau offered good visibility in all directions, allowing the city to serve as an observation post as well as a settlement. The elevation made it defensible. The agricultural land of the surrounding valleys could support the veteran population, and the proximity to the legion's base at Lambesis meant that the veterans remained in contact with the military institution that had shaped their lives and that would provide a degree of security in the uncertain frontier environment. The grid plan of Timgad is one of the most complete examples of Roman urban design principles applied at the scale of an entire new city, and it provides a direct window into the specific ideas about order, hierarchy, and civic life that organized Roman urbanism. The original city plan, which covered approximately 11 hectares within its surrounding walls, was organized on the principle of the Roman military camp, the castra, whose rectangular grid of streets defined the layout of Roman military encampments throughout the empire and provided the organizational template for Roman colonial cities. The two main streets, the Cardo running north-south and the Decumanus running east-west, intersected at the Forum, and the city's blocks were defined by a regular grid of secondary streets running parallel to the two main axes. The result was a city of extraordinary geometric regularity, its blocks of equal size, its streets of uniform width, its buildings positioned according to a consistent set of rules that gave every part of the city a predictable relationship to every other part. The Forum occupied a block slightly larger than the standard city block, positioned at the intersection of the main axes to mark its status as the center of civic life. Around the Forum were arranged the public buildings that gave a Roman city its institutional character. The Basilica, which served as the city's main hall of justice and public assembly. The temples, of which the most important was the Capitolium dedicated to the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and the colonnade of shops and offices that gave the Forum its specific visual character of ordered grandeur. The specific proportions of the Timgad grid, the dimensions of its blocks, the widths of its streets, and the size of its Forum, conform to the standard prescriptions of Roman colonial urban design that are described in the ancient technical literature on architecture and town planning. The main streets were wide enough for wheeled traffic in both directions, with raised sidewalks on either side protected by rows of columns that formed the colonnades characteristic of Roman main streets throughout the eastern and African provinces. The secondary streets were narrower, serving pedestrian and limited vehicle traffic within the residential and commercial blocks. The intersections were marked by corner columns that guided traffic and provided visual rhythm to the street network. The theater was positioned outside the original walled grid, to the south, using the natural slope of the plateau to create the curved seating banks that gave Roman theaters their characteristic form. Its capacity of approximately 3,000 seats was substantial relative to the city's initial planned population, suggesting that Timgad's founders expected it to serve as a regional center attracting visitors from the surrounding countryside as well as a civic venue for the city's own residents. The public baths, of which Timgad eventually had at least 12 complexes of varying sizes, were distributed throughout the city, with the largest of them, the Great Baths of the North, covering an area comparable to the Forum and offering the full sequence of rooms from cold to warm to hot that Roman bathing ritual required. The Library of Timgad, discovered in excavations in the early 20th century, is one of the best preserved examples of a public library from the Roman world. Its reading room, a semicircular space with recessed niches designed to hold wooden bookcases, was heated by an underfloor heating system, and its elevated position relative to the street outside gave it a degree of quiet and separation from the noise of the city that a reading room required. The existence of a public library in a frontier city of moderate size reflects the extraordinary investment in the infrastructure of literate culture that Roman urbanism at its best embodied. The presence of a library at Timgad also reflects the specific social history of the city's population. The veterans who settled Timgad were not necessarily highly educated, but they were Roman citizens who had served in a highly organized institution that valued literacy for administrative purposes. The second and third generation population that grew up in the city included the children and grandchildren of veterans who had been educated in the city's schools and who participated in the literate culture of the Roman Empire. The library served this population of increasingly educated citizens, providing access to the texts, both practical and literary, that participation in Roman civic life required. The specific collection that the Timgad Library held is not recoverable, but the architectural evidence for its size and organization suggests a collection of several hundred volumes, sufficient to support the educational and recreational reading of a provincial city's literate population, is one of the best preserved examples of a public library from the Roman world. Its reading room, a semicircular space with recessed niches designed to hold wooden bookcases, was heated by an underfloor heating system, and its elevated position relative to the street outside gave it a degree of quiet and separation from the noise of the city that a reading room required. The existence of a public library in a frontier city of moderate size reflects the extraordinary investment in the infrastructure of literate culture that Roman urbanism at its best embodied. The growth of Timgad beyond its original grid plan is one of the most archaeologically informative aspects of the city, revealing how a planned city adapted to circumstances its planners had not fully anticipated and how Roman urbanism evolved in the context of a prosperous provincial society. The original walled area of Timgad proved insufficient for the population that developed within a generation of the city's founding. The veterans who settled the city brought families, established businesses, and attracted workers, merchants, and craftspeople from the surrounding region. The agricultural land of the valleys around the plateau proved more productive than the original planners may have assumed, generating a surplus that supported a larger non-agricultural population than the original grid had been designed to house. Within a few decades of the founding, construction had extended in all directions beyond the original walls, creating suburbs that eventually covered an area several times larger than the original planned city. The temples that proliferated in Timgad's suburbs, dedicated to a wide range of deities both official and unofficial, reflect the religious diversity of a population drawn from across the Roman Empire and from the indigenous North African population. The temples to Saturn, to various forms of Fortuna, to Aesculapius the god of healing, and to the various mystery deities whose cults spread through the Roman world in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, stand alongside the official Capitolium in a religious landscape whose variety reveals the genuine pluralism of Roman provincial religious life. The evidence for religious life in the suburban areas of Timgad, where the official oversight of the city's religious authorities was presumably less intense than in the monumental core, gives a picture of popular religion that the official public inscriptions of the Forum cannot fully capture. The suburban expansion of Timgad also brought with it the expansion of the city's funerary landscape. Roman law prohibited burial within city walls, and the cemeteries of Roman cities were therefore located along the roads leading out of the city. The road cemeteries of Timgad, extending along the main roads that connected the city to the surrounding region, contained tombs of a wide range of social and economic levels, from modest tile burials that marked the graves of the poor to substantial mausolea built by wealthy families to commemorate their dead in permanent stone. The distribution of the tombs along the roads, where they would be seen by travelers entering and leaving the city, reflects the Roman understanding of burial as a public statement of family identity and social status, and the elaborate inscriptions on the more ambitious tombs were designed to be read by passers-by who would carry the memory of the deceased and of the family's generosity to a wider audience. Where the official oversight of the city's religious authorities was presumably less intense than in the monumental core, gives a picture of popular religion that the official public inscriptions of the Forum cannot fully capture. The suburban growth of Timgad shows a pattern that is characteristic of Roman provincial cities, the grid planning of the original core giving way to the more organic organization of areas that grew without a comprehensive plan, their streets following the lines of property boundaries and natural topography rather than the geometric axes of the original design. The contrast between the rigid regularity of the original grid and the more varied character of the suburbs is visible in the archaeological plan of the site, and it illustrates one of the fundamental tensions of Roman colonial urbanism: the tension between the idealized order of the planned city and the practical realities of urban growth. The suburban areas of Timgad contained a different character of building from the original core. The monumental public buildings of the Forum and the main streets gave way to the more varied architecture of residential neighborhoods, workshop buildings, and the smaller religious structures, shrines and chapels, and the meeting places of the various religious associations that flourished in the religious pluralism of the Roman Empire. The evidence for the multiple religious traditions that coexisted in Timgad, including not only the official Roman state religion but also the various mystery cults, the worship of the North African deity Baal-Hamon in his Roman guise as Saturn, and eventually Christianity, is one of the most telling indicators of the cosmopolitan character that the city developed over the 3 centuries of its Roman occupation. The physical evidence for the coexistence of multiple religious traditions in Timgad suburbs reflects a broader truth about Roman provincial society: that the official Roman state religion was only one element of a genuinely diverse religious landscape, and that the spaces outside the monumental core of the city, where official oversight was less intense and where property was cheaper and more accessible, provided the conditions for the proliferation of religious institutions that served the specific needs of different communities within the larger urban population. The shrines to healing deities that provided medical and religious services to people who could not afford physicians, the meeting houses of the various voluntary associations that combined social, religious, and economic functions, and the domestic shrines of individual households where family religion was practiced alongside the public ceremonies of civic religion. All of these formed layers of religious life that supplemented and sometimes competed with the official religion of the cities. Public monuments. The religious life of Timgad reflects the extraordinary religious diversity of the Roman Empire at its height, and the specific religious traditions documented at the site provide a picture of a city where official Roman religion coexisted with indigenous North African traditions and with the mystery cults and eventually with Christianity that characterized the religious landscape of the late antique world. The official religion of the Roman state, centered on the worship of the Capitoline Triad and the imperial cult that added deified emperors to the roster of divine recipients of public worship, was represented at Timgad by the Capitolium, whose dedication to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva made it the focal point of the city's public religious life. The imperial cult, which required periodic ceremonies of sacrifice and prayer for the health and victory of the reigning emperor, was conducted at a separate altar in the Forum, and the evidence for regular imperial cult ceremonies at Timgad is part of the broader documentation of how the Roman state used religion to bind its provincial cities to the imperial center. The specific character of North African Christianity, shaped by the particular social and intellectual conditions of the Roman province and its indigenous population, produced some of the most original theological thinking of the ancient church. The Donatist controversy that was directly addressed at Timgad in 394 CE had its roots in the persecution of Christians under Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century, when some clergy had surrendered the Holy Scriptures to imperial authorities. The Donatists, named after the bishop Donatus who led the rigorist faction, held that the sacraments administered by clergy who had lapsed during the persecution were invalid and that the Church needed to maintain strict purity. Their opponents, who received the backing of the Catholic hierarchy and eventually of the imperial court under Constantine and his successors, held that the validity of the sacraments did not depend on the personal worthiness of the clergy who administered them. The controversy divided North African Christianity for a century and was one of the central theological conflicts that shaped Augustine's own theological development. Timgad, as a city where Donatist Christianity was strong and where the conflict between the two factions was directly experienced, has a specific place in the history of this dispute. The worship of Saturn, who in Roman North Africa absorbed the characteristics of the indigenous Berber deity Baal-Hamon, was one of the most important religious traditions in the province and is well documented at Timgad. The Saturn cult combined the official recognition of the Roman state with the deep roots of indigenous North African religious practice and the specific character of Saturn worship in the region, with its emphasis on the renewal of agricultural fertility and its complex relationship to human sacrifice in its pre-Roman forms, reflects the specific religious history of the region. The evidence from Timgad for Saturn worship includes inscriptions, architectural remains of the cult site, and the votive offerings that devotees deposited in connection with their requests to and thanksgivings toward the deity. Christianity arrived in North Africa early, with the region becoming one of the most important centers of the early church by the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Timgad eventually had multiple Christian churches, including a large basilica whose remains are among the most visible structures on the site today. The city's most famous resident in the later period was not a Roman official or a wealthy landowner, but the theologian Augustine of Hippo, who was bishop of a nearby city and who attended a council at Timgad in 394 CE at which the Donatist controversy, the schism within North African Christianity that was one of the defining theological conflicts of the late antique church, was directly addressed. The connection between Timgad and Augustine's intellectual world, through the theological controversies that were played out in the churches of the region during his lifetime, gives the city a significance in the history of Christian thought that extends well beyond its status as an archaeological site. The physical evidence for Christianity at Timgad, in the form of the large basilica church and the smaller chapels and martyria that served the Christian community, reflects the transformation of the city's religious landscape that occurred following the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, when Constantine's recognition of Christianity as a legitimate religion allowed the open construction of Christian religious buildings. The basilica at Timgad, whose broad nave and side aisles follow the architectural form of the Roman civic basilica adapted for Christian worship, is one of the most substantial surviving examples of early Christian architecture in North Africa, and its construction required the investment of resources comparable to those that had been devoted to the major public buildings of the city's earlier history. The fact that such a substantial religious building was constructed in a frontier city of moderate size speaks to the depth of Christian commitment in the North African Church and to the specific historical moment at which Timgad's Christianity was expressed in permanent architectural form. Through the theological controversies that were played out in the churches of the region during his lifetime, gives the city a significance in the history of Christian thought that extends well beyond its status as an archaeological site. The water supply system of Timgad is one of the most impressive technical achievements of the city and one that reveals the extraordinary investment of resources that Rome was willing to make in the infrastructure of its frontier settlements when the political will existed to do so. Roman cities required water in quantities that seem extraordinary by the standards of pre-industrial urban life and the specific demands of Roman urbanism. The public baths, the fountains, the latrines with their continuously flowing water channels, the garden irrigation of private houses, made a reliable and abundant water supply not a luxury but a necessity for a city that aspired to the full expression of Roman civilization. The provision of this water required the construction of aqueducts that could bring water from sources sometimes tens of kilometers away, and the engineering of these aqueducts, combining sophisticated surveying, hydraulic calculation, and the construction of stone channels that maintained a precisely calibrated slope over long distances, was one of the most demanding civil engineering challenges of the Roman world. Timgad was supplied by at least 2 aqueducts whose combined capacity was sufficient not only for the drinking water needs of the population, but for the generous demands of the bath complexes and public fountains that gave Roman urban life its specific character. The survey and construction of these aqueducts, which required both the technical skill of the military engineers of the 3rd Augustan Legion and the administrative capacity to organize the labor and the materials over extended construction periods, is evidence of the seriousness with which Rome treated the provision of infrastructure to its frontier cities. The management of the city's water supply required a dedicated administrative infrastructure, the office of the curator aquarum, who was responsible for the maintenance of the aqueducts, the enforcement of the regulations governing water use, and the collection of the fees charged to private consumers. The specific regulations governing water distribution in Roman cities, known from legal texts and from the technical literature of the hydraulic engineer Frontinus, who wrote a comprehensive account of the water supply of Rome, give a picture of a highly managed resource whose allocation was carefully controlled and whose misappropriation was subject to legal sanction. The distribution of water within the city, through a network of lead pipes and stone channels that carried water from the storage cisterns at the aqueduct heads to the individual buildings and public fountains throughout the city, required maintenance and management that was organized through the city's public institutions. The water distribution system of Timgad is partially recoverable from the archaeological evidence, and its organization reflects the specific priorities of Roman urban planning, with the public baths and the major fountains receiving the largest allocations and private houses receiving their supply only when the public needs had been met. The 12 bath complexes eventually documented at Timgad represent a density of bathing facilities that is extraordinary even by Roman standards, suggesting that the city's population made intense use of bathing as a daily social activity. The Great Baths of the North, the largest of the complexes, covered an area of approximately 2,500 square meters and offered the full program of Roman bathing, from the cold plunge pool of the frigidarium through the warm tepidarium to the hot rooms of the caldarium, along with exercise areas, massage rooms, and the social spaces that made the Roman bath as much a place of conversation and business as of hygiene. The social function of the Roman bath in provincial cities like Timgad deserves emphasis, because it is easy to see the bath primarily as a sanitary facility rather than as the social institution it was. Roman bathing was a communal activity conducted in mixed company, with men and women bathing in different sections or at different times of day, but always in a public space shared with strangers and neighbors. The bath was where business was conducted, where gossip circulated, where political opinions were formed and expressed, and where the social relationships of the city were maintained and reinforced on a daily basis. For a veteran colony composed of men who had spent 25 years in the intensely communal environment of the legion, the public bath would have been a natural extension of the social patterns formed in military life, and the enthusiasm with which Timgad invested in bath facilities may reflect something specific about the social culture of a city whose original population had been shaped by the military institution. Represent a density of bathing facilities that is extraordinary even by Roman standards, suggesting that the city's population made intense use of bathing as a daily social activity and that the operators of bath facilities, whether public or private, found a sufficient market to justify repeated construction investment. The Great Baths of the North, the largest of the complexes, covered an area of approximately 2,500 square meters and offered the full program of Roman bathing, from the cold plunge pool of the frigidarium through the warm tepidarium to the hot rooms of the caldarium, along with exercise areas, massage rooms, and the social spaces that made the Roman bath as much a place of conversation and business as of hygiene. The decline and eventual abandonment of Timgad is a story that unfolds over several centuries and that involves the intersection of imperial politics, military pressure, religious transformation, and the long-term ecological and economic changes that undermined the stability of Roman North Africa in late antiquity. The 3rd century was the period of greatest difficulty for the Roman Empire as a whole, a time of military chaos, financial instability, and political fragmentation that is sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century. During this period, the Central Imperial Administration lost effective control of many of its frontier provinces, and the military garrisons that had maintained order were weakened by the demands of civil wars and barbarian invasions elsewhere in the empire. Timgad was not immune to these pressures, and the evidence from the city suggests that it experienced a significant disruption in the mid-3rd century, with some of its public buildings falling into disuse and the overall level of civic investment declining. The recovery of the 4th century, under the reorganized imperial system of the Tetrarchy and the Constantinian dynasty, brought a new period of relative stability to North Africa, and Timgad participated in this recovery. The city's Christian basilica and the other late antique religious buildings date from this period, and the evidence for active building construction into the 4th century suggests that the city remained a functioning provincial center for another century after the crisis of the 3rd century had passed. The Donatist controversy, which divided North African Christianity for more than a century, was actively contested in Timgad, and the city's role as a venue for a major church council in 394 CE indicates that it was still a city of regional importance at the end of the 4th century. The specific archaeology of Timgad's decline is visible in the changes in the city's material culture from the 3rd century onward. The high-quality mosaics and marble decoration that characterized the city's buildings in the 2nd and early 3rd centuries give way in later periods to simpler and less expensive floor treatments, reflecting both the declining wealth of the city's elite and the disruption of the trade networks that had supplied luxury materials. The evidence for the reuse of building materials, with cut stone from earlier structures being incorporated into later repairs and reconstructions, documents the transition from a city that was expanding and building anew to a city that was maintaining and adapting an existing built environment with diminishing resources. The coin evidence, while complex to interpret, suggests a reduction in commercial activity from the mid-3rd century onward, consistent with the broader disruption of the Roman monetary economy during the crisis of the 3rd century. The specific fate of Timgad's public buildings during the decline is documented by the archaeological evidence in ways that reveal the specific priorities of a society managing the deterioration of its built environment with inadequate resources. The large public buildings that required professional maintenance and substantial financial investment were the first to fall into disrepair, with the water supply system, the baths, and the monumental public spaces declining before the private residential and commercial buildings. The conversion of public spaces to private use, visible in the archaeological evidence for domestic occupation of former public buildings and the blocking of public streets for private construction, reflects the breakdown of the civic institutions that had maintained the boundary between public and private space as one of the defining features of Roman urbanism. From the mid-3rd century onward, consistent with the broader disruption of the Roman monetary economy during the crisis of the 3rd century. The 5th century brought the Vandals, who crossed from Spain into North Africa in 429 CE and conquered the entire region within a decade. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa was a genuine state that maintained many of the institutions of Roman provincial administration, but its establishment disrupted the systems of imperial subsidy and military protection on which frontier cities like Timgad had depended. The city continued to be occupied, but the investment in public infrastructure declined, and the maintenance of the water system and the public buildings became increasingly difficult to sustain. The Byzantine reconquest of North Africa in the 530s and 540s briefly restored imperial rule, and the archaeological evidence suggests some activity at Timgad in the Byzantine period. But the restoration was incomplete and the resources available were a fraction of those that had supported the city in its imperial heyday. The Arab conquest of North Africa in the 7th century transformed the religious and political landscape of the region definitively, but it was not necessarily a sudden catastrophe for specific sites. The abandonment of Timgad appears to have been a gradual process rather than a single event, with the population declining and the buildings falling into disrepair over a period of decades or longer. At some point in the late 1st millennium, the last inhabitants left, and the sand began its slow work of burial and preservation. The discovery and excavation of Timgad in the late 19th century is a story that reflects both the archaeological methods of the period and the specific political and intellectual context of French Algeria, in which the recovery of Roman remains served purposes that went beyond pure scholarship. The site of Timgad had not been entirely unknown before the excavations of 1881. Local inhabitants of the Auras region were aware of the Roman remains that protruded above the surface in various places, and European travelers had visited and described the site in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The Scottish explorer James Bruce visited in 1765 and published a description of the ruins that attracted scholarly attention to the site. But systematic excavation did not begin until 1881, when the French colonial administration authorized and funded the first major campaign under the direction of the archaeologist Robert Cagnat. The timing of the excavations is significant in the context of French colonial Algeria. France had conquered Algeria in 1830 and had been engaged since then in the project of establishing its rule over a territory and a population that had little in common with the colonizers. The recovery of Roman remains in Algeria served a specific ideological purpose in this context. It supported the claim that North Africa had a history of European civilization that predated the Arab conquest, and that French colonialism was in some sense a restoration of this earlier civilizational order rather than a simple imposition of foreign rule. The Roman connection was actively deployed in French colonial rhetoric, and the excavation and presentation of Roman sites like Timgad was as much a political project as a scientific one. The intellectual context of the excavations was shaped not only by colonial ideology but by the specific state of Roman archaeology in the late 19th century. This was a period when the systematic excavation of Roman sites was producing the foundational knowledge of Roman material culture on which 20th century classical archaeology would build, and Timgad was recognized from the beginning as an exceptionally valuable site because of the completeness and the legibility of its remains. The scholars who directed the early excavations brought genuine archaeological expertise to their work, and the publications they produced, which documented the site's inscriptions, architecture, and movable finds in substantial monographs, remain fundamental references in the scholarly literature today. The excavations conducted from 1881 onward were substantial in their scale and their results, eventually uncovering most of the original walled city and producing an enormous quantity of inscriptions, sculpture, mosaics, and everyday objects that are now distributed among the museums of Algeria and France. The methods of the early excavations were not by modern standards, involving the removal of substantial quantities of archaeological deposit without the systematic recording of finds in their spatial context that modern archaeology requires, and some information about the stratification and the distribution of objects within the city was irretrievably lost. The legacy of the French excavations at Timgad is therefore double: the extraordinary physical revelation of a Roman city that would otherwise remain unknown, and the irreversible loss of the stratigraphic information that more careful excavation would have preserved. This double legacy is not unique to Timgad but characterizes many of the great archaeological discoveries of the 19th century, when the excitement of uncovering ancient remains outpaced the development of the methods required to extract the maximum information from the excavation process. The later 20th century excavations at the site, conducted with more rigorous methods by both Algerian and international teams, have partially addressed the gaps left by the early work, and the ongoing study of the site's material culture, inscriptions, and architecture continues to produce new insights even from the remains that earlier excavations left accessible. Involving the removal of substantial quantities of archaeological deposit without the systematic recording of finds in their spatial context that modern archaeology requires, and some information about the stratification and the distribution of objects within the city was irretrievably lost. But the physical structures of the city, the streets and the forum and the theater and the baths and the arch, were revealed in a state of preservation that even with imperfect excavation methods allowed an exceptional degree of understanding of how the city had been organized and how it had functioned. The tradition of scholarship that has developed around Timgad since the initial excavations is substantial, and the city has been the subject of monographs, articles, and dissertations in French, English, Italian, German, and Arabic that address every aspect of its history and archaeology, from the structural analysis of its buildings to the economic interpretation of its inscriptions to the art-historical study of its mosaics. The cumulative effect of this scholarship is a body of knowledge about a single Roman provincial city that is unmatched for any comparable site, and that has made Timgad a touchstone for the study of Roman provincial urbanism more broadly. The continuing publication of new finds, new analyses of existing material, and new interpretive frameworks ensures that Timgad remains an active field of research rather than a subject that has been exhaustively treated and set aside. The Arch of Trajan, which stands at the western end of the main decumanus and served as the monumental gateway through which travelers approached the city from the direction of the legion's base at Lambesis, is the most immediately iconic structure at Timgad and one of the best-preserved triumphal arches in the Roman world. The arch was erected not in the time of Trajan himself, who died in 117 CE, but in the second half of the 2nd century, probably during the reign of Marcus Aurelius or Septimius Severus, when it was common to honor the founder emperor by dedicating a monument in his name. Its 3 arched openings, with the larger central arch flanked by smaller side passages, follow the standard formula of the triple-bayed triumphal arch that appears throughout the Roman world, but the specific proportions and the quality of the surviving decorative carving give the Timgad arch a quality of elegance that distinguishes it from more routine examples of the type. The specific position of the Arch of Trajan at the western gateway of the city reflects the Roman understanding of monumental arches as thresholds, as markers of the transition between different spatial and social domains. An arch at the entrance to a city was a statement about the nature of the space being entered, an assertion that the city was an ordered and governed realm distinct from the landscape outside, and a demonstration of the power and the beneficence of the authority that provided this ordering. The traveler who passed through the Arch of Trajan entered a space defined by Roman law, Roman religion, and Roman civic culture, and the arch made this transition physically and symbolically explicit. The decorative program of Roman triumphal arches typically combined architectural ornament, relief sculpture, and dedicatory inscription in a visual statement about the power and the beneficence of the authority in whose name the arch was erected. The Timgad arch carries inscriptions that have been partially legible since the monument was first described by modern scholars, and the information they preserve about the dedication and the dedicators provides a specific connection to the city's history that the purely architectural remains cannot supply. The carving of the arch's architectural decoration, including the capitals of the engaged columns, the decorative moldings of the entablature, and the ornamental reliefs that fill specific panels, shows the quality of work that skilled craftsmen in Roman provincial cities were capable of producing, drawing on a tradition of architectural carving that was ultimately derived from the workshops of Rome and the major cities of the eastern Mediterranean, but that had developed regional variations. The arch has functioned since its excavation as the most immediately legible symbol of Timgad's Roman identity, reproduced in countless photographs and used as the visual emblem of the site in tourism promotion and scholarly publications alike. Its survival to nearly its full height, with most of its decorative elements intact, is a function of the same sand burial that preserved the city as a whole, and the specific conditions of the Auras Plateau, dry and relatively stable, have been favorable to the preservation of carved limestone surfaces. The specific material from which the arch is built, the local limestone of the Auras region, weathers in a characteristic way that gives the carved surfaces a patina of age that is itself part of the aesthetic effect of the monument in its current state. The white or cream-colored stone, stained by mineral deposits and biological growth over 2 millennia, has an atmospheric quality in the low light of morning and evening that makes the arch seem at once familiar and remote, deeply connected to the Mediterranean tradition of monumental architecture and deeply embedded in the specific landscape of the North African mountains. The mountains behind the arch, their slopes covered in sparse pine and cedar, frame the monument against a sky that in winter can be deeply blue and in summer an almost metallic pale blue, and the contrast between the worked stone of Roman civilization and the natural landscape of the auras creates a visual tension that every photographer who has visited the site has tried to capture. Reproduced in countless photographs and used as the visual emblem of the site in tourism promotion and scholarly publications alike. Its survival to nearly its full height, with most of its decorative elements intact, is a function of the same sand burial that preserved the city as a whole, and the specific conditions of the Auras Plateau, dry and relatively stable, have been favorable to the preservation of carved limestone surfaces that in a wetter climate would have been significantly more eroded. The wider context of the arch within the urban landscape of Timgad is equally important for understanding its original effect. The approach to the arch along the main decumanus, with the colonnades of the street on either side creating a spatial frame that gradually narrowed the view to the arch itself, gave the structure a visual impact that is partially recoverable even today, when the street colonnades have lost most of their columns and the original spatial sequence can only be imagined. The inscriptions on the arch, read by travelers approaching the city along the road from Lambesis, announced the name of the city and its connection to the reigning dynasty, and the arch's position at the entrance to the urban space gave those inscriptions their specific rhetorical effect as a statement of civic identity addressed to every traveler who approached from the west. The inscriptions of Timgad, of which several hundred have been recovered and published, are among the most valuable documents the site has produced, providing direct access to the specific social, religious, and economic life of the city in the voices of its own inhabitants. Roman inscriptions are among the most abundant documentary sources for ancient social history, and North Africa was one of the most inscription-rich regions of the Roman Empire. The epigraphic culture of Roman North Africa, in which the permanent commemoration of significant events, relationships, and achievements in stone or bronze was a normal practice across a wide range of social classes, has produced inscriptions that document not only the official activities of city councils and imperial administrators but the private lives of merchants, craftspeople, soldiers, and their families. Timgad's inscription corpus includes dedications of public buildings, honorific inscriptions for prominent citizens and visiting officials, religious dedications from a wide range of cults, funerary inscriptions that record the names and sometimes the careers and relationships of the city's inhabitants, and practical documents like the water distribution records that provide specific information about the administrative practices of the city. The specific formula of funerary inscriptions, with their standardized abbreviations for the deceased's name, age, relationships, and the identity of the person who erected the monument, allows the statistical analysis of large corpuses in ways that provide information about demographic patterns, social relationships, and the economic capacity of different segments of the population. The analysis of Timgad's funerary inscriptions has contributed to the broader study of North African Roman demography and social history, providing data on age at death, on the prevalence of different types of family and social relationships, and on the economic and social position of the non-elite population that the honorific inscriptions of public monuments largely ignore. The funerary inscriptions are particularly valuable for the picture they give of the social composition of Timgad's population. The names recorded in the inscriptions reflect the mixture of Roman, Greek, and indigenous North African naming practices that characterized the population of a colonial city like Timgad, where the veteran settlers of Roman or Italian origin coexisted with indigenous Berber families who had adopted Roman citizenship and Roman naming conventions alongside families that retained indigenous names or combined indigenous and Roman elements. The social mobility visible in the inscriptions, in which families of non-Roman origin appear in the honorific inscriptions that recorded service to the city council and participation in civic life, reflects the relative openness of Roman colonial society to indigenous populations willing to adopt Roman cultural practices. The religious inscriptions of Timgad document the full range of the city's religious life, from the official dedications to Jupiter and the imperial cult through the Saturn worship that reflected the indigenous religious traditions of the region to the Christian inscriptions of the later period. The economic information preserved in the inscriptions of Timgad, while less systematically analyzed than the social and religious content, provides important evidence for the economic life of a provincial city that is otherwise accessible only through the indirect evidence of the material culture. Price inscriptions, which recorded the cost of specific goods or services at specific moments, provide data for the study of the Roman price history that has been one of the central concerns of economic historians of the ancient world. The inscriptions recording the activities of the city's commercial associations, the guilds of specific craftspeople and traders, document the organizational forms through which economic activity was structured and the social relationships that gave commercial life its specific character in a Roman provincial city. From the official dedications to Jupiter and the imperial cult through the Saturn worship that reflected the indigenous religious traditions of the region to the Christian inscriptions of the later period. The specific language of the religious inscriptions, the formulaic expressions of gratitude and petition that characterize votive inscriptions across the Roman world, provides access to the specific vocabulary with which the city's inhabitants conceived of their relationships with the divine, and the variety of deities invoked reflects the genuine religious pluralism of a provincial city that was connected to the broader world of the empire while also rooted in the specific religious traditions of its region. The specific contribution of North African epigraphy to the understanding of Roman social history has been one of the most productive areas of Roman historical scholarship in the 20th and 21st centuries, and Timgad's inscription corpus has been a significant part of this contribution. The systematic publication of the inscriptions of North Africa in the great epigraphic corpora that have been produced by French, Italian, and Algerian scholars has made this material available to researchers who cannot visit the sites themselves, and the ongoing digitization of the inscription databases is making the comparative analysis of large corpora of inscriptions across the empire increasingly practical. Timgad's inscriptions, read alongside those of neighboring sites and of more distant cities in other parts of the empire, provide a framework for understanding the specific ways in which the social, economic, and religious life of a Roman frontier city was both typical of Roman provincial urbanism and shaped by its specific North African context. The inscriptions are, in this sense, the city's own voice, the direct testimony of the people who lived there about the things they considered worth recording permanently, which is itself one of the most direct windows into the values of any ancient civilization. The mosaics of Timgad, recovered from the floors of private houses and public buildings across the site, are among the most significant elements of the city's artistic heritage and provide visual access to the aesthetic world of its inhabitants in a way that the architectural remains alone cannot supply. Roman mosaic pavements were the most expensive and most permanent form of floor decoration in the ancient world, and their presence in a room was both a practical statement about the wealth of the owner and a visual program that communicated specific meanings through the choice of subjects, the quality of execution, and the specific decorative vocabulary deployed. The mosaics of Timgad reflect the range of decorative traditions available to wealthy patrons in a Roman provincial city of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, from the purely geometric patterns that covered the floors of circulation spaces and less important rooms to the figured scenes of mythological subjects, hunting scenes, and representations of the natural world that decorated the reception rooms and dining spaces of the most ambitious houses. The hunting scene mosaic is one of the most characteristic subjects of North African Roman mosaic, reflecting both the specific cultural importance of the hunt as an aristocratic activity and the rich animal life of the North African landscape that provided both the subjects for artistic representation and the practical setting for the hunt itself. The specific animals represented in Timgad's hunting mosaics, including lions, leopards, bears, wild boars, and the various species of deer and antelope that inhabited the region, document a natural environment considerably richer in large mammal diversity than the modern landscape of the auras, providing indirect evidence for the ecological history of the region. The mythological subjects of Timgad's figured mosaics connected the city's private domestic spaces to the broader cultural tradition of the Roman world, whose shared literary and visual heritage, rooted in the Greek mythology that Rome had adopted and transformed, provided a common vocabulary of narrative subjects and symbolic associations available to educated patrons across the empire. The specific choice of mythological subjects for a dining room mosaic was not arbitrary but reflected the specific associations that particular myths carried in Roman culture. The Orpheus mosaic, one of the most popular subjects in Roman provincial mosaic, depicted the mythological musician charming the animals with his playing, a favorite of dining room decoration in North Africa. The geometric mosaics of Timgad, which covered the floors of circulation spaces and service rooms and which are less immediately striking than the figured mosaics but equally significant as evidence of craft production, reflect a tradition of abstract pattern-making that had deep roots in the ancient Mediterranean and that achieved extraordinary sophistication in the Roman period. The specific patterns used in the geometric mosaics, the galoche, the meander, the key pattern, the various forms of interlocking geometric units, were drawn from a repertoire that was shared across the empire and that was transmitted through pattern books and through the movement of craftspeople between workshops. The consistency of these patterns across widely separated sites reflects the integration of the empire's craft traditions into a shared visual culture, while the specific combinations and proportions used by individual workshops reflect the local variation that gave regional traditions their distinctive character, but reflected the specific associations that particular myths carried in Roman culture, their relevance to the themes of hospitality, pleasure, nature's abundance, and the good life that were appropriate to the space of convivial dining. The Orpheus mosaic, one of the most popular subjects in Roman provincial mosaic, depicting the mythological musician charming the animals with his playing, was a favorite of dining room decoration in North Africa and appears at Timgad as at many other sites in the province. The production of the mosaics at Timgad involved the work of specialized craftspeople, the tessellarii, who cut the small cubes of stone and glass from which mosaics are assembled and whose skill in the creation of figured scenes required both technical mastery and artistic training. The specific patterns and compositional conventions that appear in Timgad's mosaics connect the city's workshops to the broader tradition of North African mosaic production, centered on the major cities of the coast, and the evidence for the movement of both craftspeople and pattern books through the workshop network reflects the integration of Timgad's artistic production into the wider commercial and cultural networks of the province. The everyday life of Timgad's inhabitants is accessible through the material remains of the city in a way that the literary sources of the Roman Empire, focused as they are on the activities of the elite, cannot supply, and the archaeological evidence gives a picture of daily life in a Roman provincial city that is considerably more nuanced and more complete than the ancient texts alone would allow. The shops that lined the main streets of Timgad, their counters still in place in many cases and their storage and display facilities partially preserved, document the commercial life of a city that was integrated into the wider economy of the Roman Mediterranean. The specific goods sold in these shops, recoverable from the residues preserved in storage vessels and from the tools and equipment found in commercial deposits, included the standard items of Roman provisioning: grain and olive oil, wine, fish sauce, pottery, metalwork, and the various luxury goods that were available through the trade networks that connected even a frontier city like Timgad to the wider world. The evidence for a variety of craft production activities within the city, including the working of bone, leather, and metal, reflects the degree of economic specialization that a city of Timgad's size could support. The private houses of Timgad reveal the domestic life of a social range from the modestly prosperous to the genuinely wealthy, their varying scales of construction, the presence or absence of mosaic floors and painted wall plaster, and the specific organization of their interior spaces reflecting the social and economic position of their owners within the city's hierarchy. The largest houses of Timgad, with their peristyle courtyards surrounded by colonnaded galleries and their reception rooms decorated with high-quality mosaics, reflect the aspirations of a local elite that measured its status partly through the adoption and display of the architectural conventions of Roman aristocratic culture. The smaller houses, without colonnades or mosaics but sharing the basic organizational principles of the peristyle house type, reflect the adaptation of Roman domestic ideals to the resources of less wealthy households. The economic life of Timgad was integrated into the broader agricultural economy of North Africa, the grain-producing province that was one of the primary food suppliers of the Mediterranean world and particularly of Rome itself. The agricultural hinterland of the city produced grain, olives, and other crops that were both consumed locally and sold through the commercial networks that connected the provincial economy to the wider empire. The evidence for olive oil production in the vicinity of Timgad, including the remains of oil presses and storage facilities, documents the participation of the city's agricultural hinterland in the North African oil export trade that made the region one of the most economically important in the empire. The evidence for childhood at Timgad, visible in the toys and gaming pieces found in household deposits and in the schools whose existence is documented both by architectural remains and by inscriptions that record the activities of teachers, adds a dimension to the picture of daily life that purely monumental archaeology tends to miss. The graffiti scratched on the walls of Timgad's public buildings and streets, including the famous inscription on a monument in the Forum that records someone's opinion that hunting, bathing, playing, and laughing are the good life, give direct access to the informal voice of the city's inhabitants in a way that the formal inscriptions of public monuments cannot. The material evidence for the specific crafts practiced at Timgad, recovered from deposits of workshop waste and from the tools and equipment found in specialized buildings, includes evidence for the working of iron, bronze, bone, and leather, for the production of pottery and ceramic tiles, and for the processing of agricultural products including the pressing of olive oil and the milling of grain. The spatial distribution of these craft activities within the city, with some concentrated in specific neighborhoods and others distributed throughout the residential areas, reflects the specific economic geography of a Roman provincial city in which craft production was both a neighborhood-level activity and a specialized industrial function. The relationship between the craft production of Timgad and the wider regional economy, including the extent to which the city's workshops served an export market beyond the immediate hinterland, is a question that the archaeological evidence addresses only partially, but that is one of the more important for understanding the city's economic role in the province. Including the famous inscription on a monument in the Forum that records someone's opinion that hunting, bathing, playing, and laughing are the good life, give direct access to the informal voice of the city's inhabitants in a way that the formal inscriptions of public monuments cannot. The relationship between Timgad and its Berber hinterland, the indigenous North African population of the Ouras Mountains whose territory surrounded the city on all sides, is one of the most important and most complex aspects of the city's history, and one that the archaeological evidence illuminates only partially. The Berber people of the Ouras, ancestors of the modern Amazigh population of North Africa, had inhabited the mountains long before the Roman conquest and continued to inhabit them throughout and beyond the period of Roman rule. Their relationship with the Roman city that was established in the heart of their territory was not simple and was not exclusively one of subordination and resistance, though these elements were certainly present. The inscriptions of Timgad document the participation of people with indigenous Berber names in the public life of the city, their service on the city council, their dedications in the city's temples, and their integration into the economic life of a city that was both a market for the products of the surrounding countryside and a source of the manufactured goods that the rural population needed. The indigenous religious traditions of the Berber population left traces at Timgad, most visibly in the Saturn cult that combined Roman and indigenous North African religious elements, but also in the various shrines and cult places associated with local deities that are documented by inscriptions from the site and its surroundings. The persistence of indigenous religious practice within the framework of Roman religious pluralism reflects the broader pattern of religious synthesis that characterized Roman provincial religion, in which the official recognition of local deities under Roman names and within Roman institutional frameworks allowed the continuation of deeply rooted local practices while integrating them into the imperial religious system. The long-term relationship between the Roman city and the indigenous Berber population was not simply one of military control and cultural assimilation, but a more complex dynamic in which the indigenous population maintained its cultural distinctiveness while selectively adopting elements of Roman material culture and social practice. The specific historical trajectory of North Africa, from the Romanization of the 1st and 2nd centuries through the Vandal and Byzantine periods to the Arab conquest of the 7th century and the subsequent development of the region's distinctive combination of Arab, Berber, and Mediterranean cultural elements, gives Timgad a significance that extends beyond its Roman period. The city stands at a hinge point in the history of the region, built at the moment when Roman civilization was at its most confident and expansive in North Africa and abandoned at the beginning of the transformations that would produce the medieval North African world. Its preservation under the sand is in a sense an accident of this historical transition, the product of a change so complete that it left no reason for anyone to settle the site, and its excavation in the 19th century gave European scholarship a window into Roman North Africa at a specific historical moment that the ongoing inhabitation of most other ancient sites had made impossible to preserve. Was not simply one of military control and cultural assimilation, but a more complex dynamic in which the indigenous population maintained its cultural distinctiveness while selectively adopting elements of Roman material culture and social practice. The Berber language, Tamazight, continued to be spoken throughout the Roman period and beyond, and the indigenous naming practices that appear in the inscriptions of Timgad are evidence that Roman citizenship and Roman cultural participation did not require the abandonment of Berber identity. The specific character of the indigenous response to Roman urbanism in North Africa, which produced a class of Romanized Berber elites who participated fully in Roman civic culture while maintaining connections to indigenous traditions, is one of the most interesting examples of cultural interaction in the Roman Empire. The military dimension of the relationship between Timgad and its Berber hinterland is documented by the inscriptions that record the activities of the 3rd Augustan Legion in the region, including the periodic campaigns against groups identified as raiding or resistant to Roman authority. The specific character of this military activity, which appears to have involved both punitive expeditions against groups that raided the settled zone and the construction of roads and watchtowers that extended Roman control into the mountain valleys, reflects the ongoing effort of the Roman administration to maintain the security of the settled agricultural zone against the threats that came from the less controlled desert margin. The modern history of Timgad, from its excavation in the 1880s to its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982 and its current situation as one of the most important archaeological sites in North Africa, is a story that involves the intersection of archaeology, colonial politics, post-colonial national identity, and the ongoing challenges of archaeological site management in a region with limited conservation resources. The French excavations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries transformed Timgad from a largely buried ruin into the partially exposed city that visitors see today, but they did so within a specific colonial context that shaped both the methods used and the interpretive frameworks applied. The presentation of Timgad as a monument of Roman civilization, and by extension of European civilization in North Africa, served French colonial ideology in ways that the Algerian scholars who have taken responsibility for the site since independence have had to consciously negotiate. The reinterpretation of Timgad as a monument not only of Roman history but of Algerian history, and of the Berber and North African dimensions of the city's life as well as its Roman character, has been one of the ongoing intellectual projects of Algerian archaeology since independence in 1962. The UNESCO World Heritage designation of 1982 brought international recognition and some international resources to the conservation of the site, but the ongoing maintenance of the extensive exposed ruins presents challenges that have not been fully resolved. The exposed stone surfaces of the buildings, which have been subjected to weathering, biotic growth, salt crystallization, and the physical impact of visitor traffic since their excavation, are in a significantly worse condition than they were at the moment of excavation, and the resources available for systematic conservation treatment have not been sufficient to address the full extent of the deterioration. The specific conservation challenges of Timgad, including the management of vegetation growth through the masonry, the treatment of salt efflorescence that is detaching the surfaces of carved stones, and the stabilization of standing wall sections that have been weakened by frost and rain, require sustained technical expertise and financial investment that is difficult to maintain consistently. The specific challenges of archaeological site management in Algeria reflect the broader context of a country that emerged from a devastating war of independence against French colonialism and that has since navigated the complex politics of post-colonial nation-building alongside significant internal conflicts in the 1990s. The investment in cultural heritage management has been inconsistent with the level that the UNESCO World Heritage designation and the international reputation of the site might suggest would be appropriate, though the commitment of Algerian archaeologists and site managers to the preservation and study of the site has been genuine and sustained. The situation of Timgad illustrates a broader challenge for the heritage of the ancient world. The sites that most need investment for their preservation are often in the places least able to provide it, while the resources and the expertise that could address the conservation challenges are concentrated in the wealthy countries whose connection to the specific heritage in question may be more distant. The visitor experience at Timgad, for those who make the journey to the relatively remote location in the Ouras Mountains, is one of the most exceptional available at any Roman site in the world. The scale of the exposed city, the completeness of the street plan, and the legibility of the individual structures give the visitor a sense of a Roman city as a functioning whole that is rare even at the best preserved sites in Italy and the Balkans. The relative remoteness of the site, which limits the number of visitors and means that the ruins are often encountered in conditions of relative quiet, contributes to an experience that the heavily visited sites of Italy and Greece rarely allow. The specific itinerary that a visitor follows through Timgad, entering through the main gate, walking the decumanus toward the Forum with the Arch of Trajan visible at the far end, visiting the theater and the public baths, reading the inscriptions in the Forum, and standing in the library whose curved walls once held the books of a frontier city, is an itinerary that moves through a complete cross-section of Roman urban life rather than focusing on a single monument or a single type of structure. The completeness of the city plan, which allows the visitor to understand the relationship between the different types of public space and between the public and the private sectors of the city, gives Timgad a didactic quality as a window into Roman urbanism that the more fragmentary remains of other sites cannot provide. A visitor who spends a full day at Timgad comes away not only with an impression of a specific city, but with a specific understanding of how a Roman city was organized and what it was designed to do. The theater of Timgad, which used the natural slope of the plateau to create the curved banks of stone seating that could accommodate 3,000 spectators, is one of the best preserved examples of a Roman theater in North Africa and one of the most evocative spaces in the entire site. Roman theaters served multiple purposes beyond the performance of drama in the classical sense, and the range of events staged in them reflects the broader character of Roman public entertainment culture. Theatrical performances included not only the comedies and tragedies of the classical tradition but the mime and pantomime that were more popular with Roman provincial audiences, the musical performances that accompanied theatrical events, and the various spectacles that blurred the boundary between theatrical performance and arena entertainment. The theater was also used for public assemblies and announcements, for the performance of religious rituals associated with theatrical festivals, and for the display of the civic beneficence of the wealthy patrons who funded theatrical events as a form of public service. The festivals that filled the Timgad Theater with its 3,000 spectators were not casual entertainment but formally organized religious and civic events, embedded in the ritual calendar that gave Roman public life its specific temporal structure. The theatrical festivals were associated with particular deities, performed as part of the religious obligations of the city's magistrates, and funded by the personal wealth of the magistrates in a system of compulsory generosity that was one of the primary mechanisms through which the wealthy elite of a Roman provincial city demonstrated its commitment to the community it led. The record of theatrical benefactions at Timgad, preserved in inscriptions that record the names of the magistrates who funded specific events and the specific performances they provided, gives a picture of a cultural life that was shaped as much by the social obligations of civic leadership as by the artistic preferences of the city's population. The physical remains of the Timgad Theater document the specific technology of Roman theatrical production, including the remains of the wooden stage machinery that could produce special effects, the drainage systems that managed rainwater during outdoor performances, and the arrangements for the awnings that provided shade for the audience in the hot months of the North African summer. The quality of the stonework in the theater's permanent elements, including the carved decoration of the stage building facade that faced the audience, reflects the investment that the city's founders and early benefactors made in a facility that was expected to serve the city's cultural needs for generations. The acoustics of ancient theaters, whose specific properties were understood and deliberately exploited by ancient architects, are one of the dimensions of Roman theatrical culture that modern visitors can experience directly, in a way that the other aspects of ancient theatrical life, the texts of the performances, the music, the costumes, the social rituals of attendance, cannot be recovered. The curved form of the seating bank, whose specific geometry focuses sound from the stage toward the audience, and the reflective surface of the orchestra floor, which amplifies and distributes sound in ways that modern acoustic engineers have studied and admired, give the theater a functionality that is not merely historical but immediately accessible to anyone who speaks from the stage. The experience of standing in the orchestra of the Timgad Theater and looking up at the 3,000 stone seats that once held the city's population on festival days gives a specific sense of scale and community that few ancient remains can match. The seats are empty now, their stone worn smooth by 2,000 years of weather rather than by the bodies of theatergoers, but the geometry of the space communicates directly what it was designed to communicate. That 3,000 people gathering here were not an incidental collection of individuals but a community, organized in space, directed toward a shared experience, embodying in their physical arrangement the specific Roman understanding of what it meant to be citizens of a city. The specific experience of attending a theatrical performance at Timgad in the 2nd century, making one's way through the streets from the residential quarter or the forum, joining the crowd filing into the theater through the vaulted entrance passages, finding one's seat in the curved bank of stone, and watching the performance against the backdrop of the elaborately decorated stage building, was an experience that combined the pleasures of entertainment with the social rituals of civic belonging. The specific social protocol of the Roman theater, in which different sections of the seating were reserved for different social categories, with the best seats at the front for the city's elite and the upper banks for the general population, made the theater a visual representation of the city's social hierarchy even as it assembled that hierarchy in a shared experience. The theater at Timgad was therefore not merely a venue for entertainment, but a machine for the production and reproduction of the social order that governed the city's life. Walking through Timgad today, through the exposed streets of a city that was buried for 12 centuries and that has been revealed only within living memory, produces a specific quality of historical experience that few ancient sites can replicate. The streets are still laid in their original paving stones, worn smooth by the feet of 2,000 years ago and then preserved under the sand for 1,200 years more. The wheel ruts cut by the carts of the 2nd century are still visible in the stone. The stepping stones that allowed pedestrians to cross the street without getting their feet wet in rain or in the water that flowed in the street gutters are still in place. The threshold stones of the shops, with the marks of the hinges that once held their doors, are still there. These details, which would be lost in a site that had been continuously occupied, were sealed in place by the abandonment and preserved by the sand, and their presence gives the site a quality of immediacy, of closeness to the lives of its ancient inhabitants, that the more impressive but more restored monuments of Rome and Pompeii sometimes lack. The Forum of Timgad, where the city's public life was concentrated, gives the strongest sense of the city as a functioning place rather than a ruin. The colonnade that ran around the forum's perimeter, its columns still standing in many sections, creates an enclosure whose scale communicates directly the ambition of the city's founders. The paving of the forum floor, which would have been the scene of markets, political gatherings, legal proceedings, and the casual social encounters that Roman public life was organized around, is still largely in place. The bases of statues that once stood in the forum and whose inscriptions recorded the names and achievements of honored citizens are visible at regular intervals, their surfaces blank now, but the positions they mark still telling the story of a civic culture that expressed its values through the permanent commemoration of its most distinguished members. The light at Timgad in the early morning, before the heat of the Algerian plateau becomes oppressive and before the few visitors who make the journey from the nearest town arrive, has a quality that belongs to a place that is accustomed to solitude. The Auras Mountains rise behind the site to the north and east, their rocky slopes catching the first sun. The sound of the wind across the plateau replaces the sound of the city that once filled this space with the voices and the footsteps and the machinery of urban life. The sand that buried the city for 12 centuries has been removed, but its work of preservation is permanent. The city that was sealed under the desert is now exposed to the desert sky, and the stones that were protected by burial are now subject again to the slow attrition of wind and rain and frost. What the sand gave, it cannot give again. The preservation that made Timgad remarkable was a gift of a specific historical accident, the abandonment of a functioning city so complete that nature sealed it before humanity could strip it. That gift has been partially spent in the century and a half since the excavations began. The future of what remains depends on resources and attention that archaeology competes for against the many other legitimate demands of a country with significant challenges beyond the management of ancient ruins. Timgad will not disappear, but it will change, and the city that the archaeologists of the 1880s found, intact under its sand, is already something slightly different from the city that visitors encounter today. The sand that preserved it is gone. The history that it contains is not. The significance of Timgad for the understanding of the Roman Empire extends beyond what it tells us about the specific city itself. It provides a model of Roman provincial urbanism at a level of completeness that no other single site can match, allowing the questions that have been formulated about Roman urban life on the basis of fragmentary evidence from other sites to be tested against a more complete physical record. The relationship between the planned core and the organic suburbs, the distribution of different types of buildings across the urban fabric, the evidence for the social and economic stratification of the population, the documentation of the city's religious life across 3 centuries of change. All of these are accessible at Timgad in ways that they are not accessible at other sites, and the accumulation of this knowledge has contributed significantly to the broader understanding of how Roman cities worked and what Roman urbanism meant to the people who experienced it. And the city that the archaeologists of the 1880s found, intact under its sand, is already something slightly different from the city that visitors encounter today. The sand that preserved it is gone. The history that it contains is not. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.